Chapter 40, October 24th, 2173, 0154 local time, Ilium, Tesselia System, Nos Astra, Ad Astra Branch HQ. I walked into the command room with purposeful steps. The shower and fresh clothes helped me feel truly alive again. Even the remaining vestiges of my headaches had disappeared. Perhaps it was the pills I had been given by Dr. Herman or the hot shower followed by a cold one. In the end, it didn't matter why, and I was just happy that the annoying fog that had impeded my thoughts wasn't around anymore. Vice Commander Cheryl Olivier had waited for me outside the room with 2 Ad Astra security guards and escorted me to the command room. The Vice Commander led the way from the front, and the 2 guards were only half a step behind me to my left and right sides. They weren't taking any chances with my security, and a discreet look from me revealed that they were hyper-vigilant about anything that was going on around them, even inside the building. Perhaps they acted a bit too paranoid. An attack on me inside the heart of Ad Astra's building was almost an impossibility, but I couldn't hold it against them. After all, an attack outside the building had been improbable too, yet the events a few days ago showed them that improbable didn't mean impossible. I would give it a few weeks before this new level of vigilance returned to the previous one. Well, a few weeks after the Ilium situation got resolved. On our way to the command room, I got a grasp of the general atmosphere inside the building. Everywhere we passed, there was tension in the air, and the closer we got to the command room, the thicker it became. Yet I could also feel how some of that tension disappeared whenever some of my employees got a look at me, walking tall and uncowed through the halls. I had made sure, even before I left the bathroom, that my expression showed no signs of worry, and that the only emotion anyone could glean from it was the steely determination to bring the situation to a satisfactory end. When I entered the command room, the hairs on my arms stood up, and I could feel the electric tension of the room washing over my whole body as if I had just another shower. The first word that came to mind when I observed the ongoings was controlled chaos. On the left and right sides of the room, people either sat at holographic workstations analyzing the incoming pieces of information or running around coordinating with their fellows. The far side was dominated by dozens of smaller video screens centered around another much bigger screen where information about the ongoing operations on Ilium got displayed. At the same time, several live video feeds played, showing ongoing operations on the lower streets. The middle of the room was slightly elevated, and a table displaying a holographic model of the operational area filled most of the space. Standing right in front of the table with her back turned to me stood a woman with short-cropped blonde hair. Her head moved up and down to look at the holographic display and the video feeds in front of her, probably comparing the 2 sources of information. I could only see her back, but I recognized her immediately. Anything else would have been embarrassing for me. After all, if I didn't recognize the commander of the local Ad Astra security forces, it would mean that I wasn't in the condition to make decisions that could cost people's lives. As I walked toward the center of the room, I got a better look at the commander of my security forces, and a small frown appeared on my face. If Commander Catherine Abebe had to be described in one word, the word I would choose would be stern. She was a no-nonsense woman that didn't take kindly to people joking around on duty. Yet there were also instances where she overlooked people breaking regulations, especially whenever she recently talked with her daughter, that was living with her ex-husband on Amaterasu. In the same manner, the people under her command knew to give her a wide berth when she talked to her ex, since doing that always put her in an unforgiving mood. I didn't know if it was true, but rumors were floating around that she made people run laps around the whole building for breathing too loud. "Commander Abebe, what's the situation up here?" I asked as I got closer. She turned her head and looked at me with her poison green eyes that somehow meshed very well with her slightly darker skin tone. "Could be worse," Commander Abebe grumbled, her voice a soothing alto. "Our forces are still getting pushed back at the Lele docks, but they're holding the line better now than a few hours ago. Our current position is well defended, and it will take the enemy more than a few tries and dozens of people to dislodge us from it. I won't lie and say it will hold indefinitely, but our men will take their pound of flesh before they're forced to give it up." "Very good. We will need the docks to keep the company running," I commented, scratching my chin with my index finger as I thought about the situation. Furthermore, the Lely docks are much too close to HQ, in my opinion. If the enemy takes them, it will take too much time for additional forces from outside the system to land and make their way here. By the way, what is the response from Ilium's government? I can't imagine that the police forces are doing nothing after this sudden outbreak of violence. In that regard, you would be wrong, Mr. Denneburn, responded Commander Ababe negatively while shaking her head. Officially, this isn't more than a minor altercation between two rival gangs, and the government officials only released a travel warning to the area. The Ilium police force sent 3 teams to investigate, and only 2 returned. And those 2 swear that they saw nothing that would require any obvious show of force from the police department, and that they didn't know what happened to the 3rd team. In their words, this gang war should be over in less than 2 weeks, and the best they could do would be to let it happen. Somebody is making sure the conflict stays under the radar. Someone with enough influence in the government and police circles. Else the police wouldn't sit on their thumbs. They got a slew of bad press last year, and they wouldn't miss this opportunity to present themselves in a good light otherwise, I deduced. Commander Abebe grimaced, and the tightening of her face highlighted the small scars that were all over her face from the dozens of conflicts she had been in. Whatever the reason, she said, on the one hand, I'm glad that we won't have to worry about their involvement. After all, they could hinder us just as much as our opponents. On the other hand, they probably would have been decent help. She thought for a moment about her statement before she scoffed quietly. Well, there would be more people at least. I know what their equipment is like. Good enough for the smaller gangs around the plant. But since we're dealing with a platoon of Eclipse mercenaries here, they wouldn't be more than a short distraction. What is your recommendation? I asked, turning the topic away from Ilium's police force and their non-existent help. How should we proceed? I don't know all the details, and military tactics and strategies are your area of expertise anyway. Having more men on the ground would be a good first step, but I don't know where I should get them from. There is unrest at all our branches after the news about the attack on you got released, and most could only spare a few men. Not enough to justify sending them here, and traveling around to collect them all would have been a time-consuming endeavor. Furthermore, most of our forces are bound to the border between the Alliance, the Batarian hegemony, and the Terminus systems for anti-piracy operations, and to keep our interests safe. Any projections on how my appearance on the news would change that? I asked. The slight unrest should calm down after that. At least, I hope so. It would free up more people. While that is true, we can't bank on that. And even then, with the fighting happening in the Batarian hegemony, we still can't get our most experienced people from the border. After all, the fighting could easily spill over into the Alliance. Fighting inside the hegemony? It seems like some important events happened while I was unconscious. The confusion I felt must have appeared on my face as Commander Abebe was about to explain. But before she could utter a word, I held up my left hand and shook my head negatively. Getting the abridged summary about the galactic events of the last few days could wait for a few moments more. The problem at hand was far more important right now in my eyes. So we need numbers and people with experience, I mused. In the best-case scenario, it would be numbers with experience. If we sent for every person the different branches could free up, we would have the numbers at least. And among them, there will be people with experience. But it won't do us much good. Most of them will get slaughtered if they encounter trained Eclipse mercenaries. They're trained as guards and for policing actions, not for fighting like soldiers. Our forces here had the same problem. The people under my command are slowly adapting to the challenges they face, but it cost us good men. I pondered on the question for a few moments. We needed more people on the ground, and they needed to have some experience in battlefield tactics and going against opponents that knew how to handle the weapons in their hands. Sadly, Commander Abebe was right. Most of Ad Astra's forces were simple security guards, and even our strike teams wouldn't be enough to turn the tide by themselves. Besides, there weren't enough of them, and almost all were in positions where withdrawal could spell disaster. Furthermore, it wasn't just people we needed equipment too. The commander hadn't spoken of it yet, but I knew the equipment our troops here on Ilium used wasn't the best we had in stock. In an ideal world, our troops would use the newest generation, but those were reserved for the Alliance military. To prevent the accusation that I was building a private army, I signed a few agreements that prohibited me from equipping my security forces with the same gear I supplied the military with. Not that a single generation between the models would make a significant difference, but it kept my detractors quiet. It created an illusion of superiority for the Alliance military, and that image was important. Besides, it also created the image that I put the protection of the Alliance as a whole before my own self. And that kind of image would only further help me when I started to concentrate fully on politics. Yet, as my thoughts turned to the equipment issue, an idea suddenly popped into my head, and a sly smile crept onto my face. "Sir?" questioned Commander Abebe when she saw the smile on my face. "Do you have an idea?" "I would like to think so," I answered cryptically and turned to one of the communication officers running around, identifying him by the color of the border of the Ad Astra Security Forces patch sewn to the right shoulder of his uniform. "Please, open a connection to Commander Svensson on Praxium 3. The security code is XX20A453GF, Sparta." The communication officer acknowledged my order with a salute and ran to his station to open the connection as fast as possible. Commander Abebe looked at me with a questioning look, but decided to stay quiet for the moment and trusted that I knew what I was doing. I stood to Commander Abebe's left and leaned slightly forward with my hands on the holographic table to support my weight as I looked forward at the biggest screen on the opposite wall. At first, it still showed the bird's eye view of the current operational area before it turned into a black screen with the writing "Establishing Connection." It didn't take long before the screen changed once again and showed the bored face of a man in uniform. He wore a pair of black glasses and the brown eyes behind it were half closed. All in all, the person I suspected was Commander Svensson's secretary looked like he had just woken up. Since I didn't know the time on Praxium 3, that could very well be true, but it still somehow annoyed me to see such a lax attitude. And the moment when the secretary opened his mouth didn't help in the slightest to reduce that feeling. "You reached Commander Svensson's office. How can I help you?" he asked, yet didn't look up from whatever he was reading. "I would like to talk to the commander," I said, and did my best to not let the annoyance I felt influence my tone. Apparently, this so-called secretary hadn't even checked the connection code, or else he would have seen that it was a Priority 1 code, specifically my code, and he would have put me straight through to the commander. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I wasn't aware I would need one," I responded. "The commander is a very busy man. If you leave your name and a preferred time, I will check if the commander's available then." I could almost physically feel how my thread of patience snapped, one fiber after the other. "How about now?" I growled, the aggression and annoyance clear in my voice. "And my name is Oscar Denebrin. So put me through to Commander Svensson, or I will make sure that you won't find another job inside Alliance and Citadel territory for the rest of your pathetic life. I neither have the time nor the patience to deal with this kind of shit." The secretary finally looked up, and I felt a good bit of satisfaction in the way his eyes widened in shock and fear at my words. His whole demeanor changed in the blink of an eye, and he choked out a fearful, "Of course, sir. At once, sir." He pushed a few buttons on the keyboard in front of him, and the screen changed again to black before the picture of another man appeared. This one looked far more awake and ready than the previous one, and that was one fact that I was glad for, else I probably wouldn't be able to calm down in the slightest, and the commander wouldn't hold on to his job for much longer. Yet I knew that Commander Svensson wasn't the kind of person I would have any problems with from here on out. Commander Svensson was a man in his late 50s with dark blue eyes and blonde hair with dozens of gray streaks. His weather-beaten face spoke of a life that was by no means easy, but the deep laughter lines that looked like they were carved into his face also added to the story that there had been enough happy times too. He looked up the moment the connection was established, and his eyes widened minimally when he saw who was calling him. "Sir, it's good to see you awake." Commander Svensson greeted me and threw a hasty salute. "My men have been a bit restless since they got the news. They already wanted to pack their things and travel to Ilium to give whoever's behind this situation a piece of their mind." There was a joyful glint in his eyes and an easy smile played over his lips. "Glad to hear that," I answered with a smile, thankful that it seemed like I choose correctly. In fact, I would like to see that happen. And as fast as possible, too. We could use the help here on Ilium. What's happening on Ilium? Commander Svensson asked. Any hint of joy at seeing me unharmed disappeared and got replaced by seriousness. A gang war and some tussles with Eclipse mercenaries, all staged by whoever's behind the attack on me. We need more people with experience on the ground. That's why I called you. I definitely have more than enough people that know which end of the rifle to point at the enemy. And I don't even have to ask them if they're willing to come, but to relocate my people will ruffle some feathers. And not just of those in the military, some desk jockeys in the government will also try to get in the way. Leave that to me, I declared with finality. While some will try to get in the way, the people I know that will help me are better placed than those. Furthermore, when I call my associates, I'm going to call it a live-fire exercise, or that we're going to test the equipment in high-stress situations. Commander Svensson blinked a few times before he started to laugh loudly. Live-fire exercise, huh? The men are going to love this. While our staged battles are great training and we learn every kink and quirk of our equipment, nothing can replace the experience of an actual battle. Any doubts that your men can handle this? As you said, they're very well trained, but they don't have any actual experience. They won't hesitate if that's what you're worried about, declared Commander Svensson. It is true that they're not real soldiers, but they won't lose to anybody else in the Ad Astra security forces. He scratched his head with his right hand, looking a bit sheepish. Well, except for those guys on anti-piracy duty. Those guys are pretty hardcore when they get going. My guys can hold their own on the ground, but they got put down, and hard at that, when it came to boarding exercises. Then it is good that we will need them on the ground. How fast can you redeploy? It will take a day to get everything ready, so I estimate that we will be on Ilium in 72 hours from now on. All right, 72 hours is the deadline. I believe we will be able to hold out for so long, I said while glancing to the side to see Commander Abebe's reaction. She responded with a nod to my unasked question, but I noticed that she looked a bit tense. So I guessed that, while we would be able to hold on to our current positions for so long, it would take a lot out of the men defending them. Try to be faster than this if it is possible, or send in a vanguard and bring the newest toys in with the second wave. We need those men as soon as possible. I'll do my best, sir, responded Commander Svensson with another salute and ended the connection, to begin with his work. As far as I knew him, he would get to work right this moment, and it wouldn't take more than an hour or two until all units under his command would scramble to get their things ready as fast as possible. And me? I was just happy that the manpower issue got solved. It was one less problem on my list. I turned my attention to the communication officer who established the connection to Commander Svensson and said, please check which transports are the closest to Praxium 3 and redirect them there. They will need more than the 2 frigates that are there. Use the priority code OLEG 435-DEN. It should make things run smoothly, as long as their operators aren't as dense as that secretary. I whispered the last sentence more to myself to vent the remaining annoyance I felt, but Commander Abebe heard me and agreed with a grunt. Apparently, she felt the same as I did. Not very surprising, as she was a stickler for the rules. But since that guy wasn't under her command, she couldn't censor him for his conduct. Instead, she asked me the question that had been burning on her tongue since I asked to be connected to Commander Svensson. If I may ask, Mr. Dennebrun, she began, hesitating momentarily before she continued. But who is Commander Svensson? I haven't heard of him before today. Not very surprising, I answered. Commander Svensson has been in Ad Astra's service as the commander of the testing corps for nearly a decade. He lost his leg during his time in the Alliance military and can't act as a regular commander anymore. Yet his mind is still as sharp as ever, and he has a knack for finding new and inspired ideas to use tactics and equipment outside the usual standards. He's heading the testing corps, a unit that is charged with testing every piece of equipment that comes out of Ad Astra and its subsidiaries' factories before the Alliance gets a chance to add them to their arsenal. They test everything, from weapons and vehicles to mundane things like backpacks. Furthermore, they do it in every environment possible. Urban, mountains, deserts, jungle, and grassy plains. While Praxium III doesn't have all those terrains on the planet itself, the surrounding moons and planets have them. The star system is perfect for the testing process. And how many people does he have under his command? Around 200 people, I said, noticing how her eyes widened at my words. 200? She repeated unbelievingly, especially since she hadn't heard of the unit before today. It only got to this number 2 years ago. Before that, they only had around 40, but Svensson came up with some good arguments during a meeting with some Alliance brass to get permission to increase the number. It is to simulate ground warfare more realistically and whatnot. In exchange, they are not allowed to operate outside the Praxium system, but since these are extraordinary circumstances, I'm sure I can bend the rules for some time before anyone tries to use the situation for their benefit. I will use up some goodwill for that, but that will recover in time. Right now, responded Commander Abebe, after pulling herself together after learning about Ad Astra's hidden strength, I don't really care. I just want those men here and finally get back at Eclipse. Agreed, I added before changing the topic. And since our manpower problem is now solved, what can you tell me about the situation in the rest of the galaxy? Your second-in-command mentioned something about the Batarian hegemony. There is conflicting news coming out of there, but most speak of a planet up in arms because of the assassination of some kind of religious man. Apparently some Batarian noble ordered his execution, and the lower classes are up in arms about it. The most outrageous rumors claim that the whole planet is rebelling against the ruling class. Oh, I said, interest shining in my eyes, and I could feel how a smile started to stretch over my face. Please tell me more. Sounds interesting. And it was interesting. I didn't know if that was Andrew's intention or just a beneficial side effect, but everything that caused the Batarians trouble was sure to benefit the Alliance. Chapter 41. October 25th, 2173, 0532, local time, Ilium, Tessol System, Nos Astra, Spaceport Area, Tanya Folly, Ad Astra Security Forces. The first rays of the sun started to paint the top of the skyscrapers in a bright mix of orange and yellow. Tanya had to crane her neck to look up, something quite uncomfortable with her armor on. But for a moment, she felt at peace, and her weariness disappeared. The night had passed without any incident. No attack by Eclipse, or any of the gangs they had allied with. Yet her team's captain kept them on guard, and with every minute closer to the time their replacement would arrive, he got more paranoid about an attack. Still, Tanya could understand his apprehension. The last few days hadn't been easy for anyone of the Ad Astra security forces. Fight after fight, people died left and right, and the enemies seemed never-ending. It was exhausting. And after all that, Eclipse wouldn't try to push their position for almost 10 hours? She tried to not let her thoughts ruin the moment of peace she got, but she couldn't help but to start sharing the feelings of her team's captain. Something was going to happen, and soon she just knew it. It took only one look around, and she knew that whatever was going to happen would hit her team hard. Half her team was barely keeping their eyes open. An adrenaline boost could only do so much when the mind was tired. Her captain had pushed them hard this night during their guardship, but Tanya couldn't resent him for it. After all, Ad Astra's security forces were stretched thin, and they couldn't rely on their so-called allies, this damn criminal scum, to pick up the slack, especially after the last time, when a third of the gang members on guard turned around and fired on their own people. Fucking traitors, Tanya swore in her mind. I always knew it was a dumb idea to trust them. They only remember the word loyalty when you hold a gun right into their faces and forget it just as fast when you turn around. When a person suddenly appeared next to her, Tanya unconsciously tensed, waiting for an attack before she glanced to the side and visibly relaxed when she recognized him. It was her partner Boris Svetkova, who had decided that he rested enough to keep her company for the rest of their guard shift. Anything unusual, he grumbled, his voice thick with an accent that Tanya couldn't identify and had never truly cared enough to ask about after she found out Boris detested talking about his early life. Nothing, she responded before adding, and that is something I worry about. So you and the captain think alike. It's less thinking alike than being cautious. Eclipse attacked in regular intervals. We could almost set the clock after them. And now they're not doing anything? I don't trust this calm, Tanya responded, shaking her head. When you put it that way, it sounds reasonable. Boris took a deep breath and looked around warily. So you believe they want us to relax our guards before striking? It's what I would do, exhaust the defenders by keeping them in suspense before attacking when they least expect it. If that's the case, I would have attacked more than an hour ago. I heard somewhere that our performance is minimal around 2 or 3 a.m. While she didn't know if Boris's statement was scientifically proven, Tanya thought there had to be some truth to it. After all, around that time she always felt more tired. But if she stayed awake, some of the tiredness disappeared. If that was the case for others, Tanya didn't know, and if she was truthful with herself, didn't particularly care to find out. There was a reason why she had become a member of Ad Astra's security forces and not an academic, as her mother had hoped. But you're forgetting one thing, she replied after she had mulled over Boris's statement. We're not dealing with other humans. Do you believe those fucking aliens care about us? They got their noses too far up in their asses for that. If anything, as Eclipse is mostly consisting of Asari, they would attack at a time when they are at their weakest. And what time is that? Asked Boris. But one look at him, and one could see that he wasn't expecting Tanya to know the answer to his question. Something she confirmed with an uncaring shrug. How should I know? I haven't studied Asari biology or any other alien biology. Didn't see the appeal. All I know is that if you shoot them, they die, just like any other living being. What else is there to know? Her response was answered by a sigh from Boris and a shake of his head, his way of showing her that he disapproved of her uncaring nature towards the other galactic species. They often had arguments concerning that issue. He was of the opinion that as members of Ad Astra, they should try to set an example for the rest of the human race. Tanya, on the other hand, couldn't give a rat's ass about the other species. Her father had died on Shanxi thanks to the Turians' overreaction, and most of her biases started after the event. Intellectually, she knew that the other species weren't to blame for the loss of her father. Hell, even most Turians weren't to blame, but she had been left with a very low opinion of aliens, and almost everything she found out about them hadn't helped revise the picture. She was about to throw a snarky comment toward Boris, and perhaps start the argument once again. After all, it would certainly be more entertaining than staring into the concrete jungle around them when suddenly someone started screaming. Boris and Tanya's heads whipped around to locate the source of the scream. It was Boris who spotted the screamer first. One of the various gang members that loitered around and were supposed to support the Ad Astra members rolled around on the ground, his right hand clutching his left shoulder. A dark blue pool of blood slowly spread under the Turian. It took a few seconds for everyone to realize what was happening, but the moment someone shouted, "We're under attack!" they threw themselves at the defense barricades. It was just in time, too, as moments later, the rattle of dozens of mass accelerators echoed through the docks, and the barricades got hit by hundreds of bullets. "Why isn't the shield generator running?" shouted a voice from somewhere, and Tanya recognized it as her team's captain's voice. "I don't care what happened," he shouted after a momentary pause. "Just get it running, or we're going to have to mop up a lot more blood than necessary after we're done with fucking those Eclipse assholes up." "Well," said Boris, barely loud enough to be heard over the screaming and gunfire, "they did attack. I would prefer it if I had been wrong." Tanya spat out before glimpsing over the barricade and firing a burst from her rifle at some Eclipse mercenaries that, sadly, had enough luck to duck behind a wall without being hit. And missing the opportunity to say, "I told you so." "I think not," returned Boris while taking a grenade off his belt. His thumb hit the activator, and his head shot up and down to take stock of the situation. He didn't need a second look before he threw the grenade, and a small smile played over Tanya's lips when she heard the screams of Eclipse soldiers after the grenade exploded. "Good throw." "Thanks. Now let's give them hell." During the fight, Tanya lost every feeling concerning the passing of time. She only concentrated on keeping herself and Boris alive, peeking out of cover, shooting at the targets she could see, and ducking whenever shots hit close to her. Absent-mindedly, she followed her team's captain's order to retreat to the secondary defensive position after the shield generator rebooted, and it was clear that it somehow didn't get enough energy to create a decent enough shield to cover the primary defensive position without sacrificing its much-needed integrity. When the call to retreat came, she helped Boris drag a wounded Ad Astra officer behind the next set of covers. The man was barely conscious and pumped full with medicaments and Medigel, but he still had an iron grip on his rifle, firing at the enemy lines without care, just to give them covering fire. After they finally got behind cover, one of the field medics ran over to take him off Tanya's and Boris' hands, and without even taking a moment to take a deep breath, the two of them ran back to their positions to support their comrades. She only started to lose her narrow-minded focus on the battlefield when she heard the familiar noise of a shuttle's engine coming up from behind their defensive line. Apparently, Boris heard it too, as he spun with her into cover, and they trained their rifles in the direction the shuttle was coming from. Tanya let out a sigh of relief when she noticed the colors of the shuttle and the symbol painted on its side. Next to her, Boris let out a relieved, "It's about time," and turned back towards the fight to give enough covering fire to let the shuttles land without too many problems. It wasn't like Tanya wasn't relieved too, but there were some things that confused her enough to not turn her attention back to the battle immediately. The model of the shuttle wasn't one she recognized as being part of the vehicle fleet at the Ad Astra headquarters here on Ilium. It looked far more like a military transport than the shuttle that flew her and her fellow Ad Astra officers to this position. Furthermore, right next to the Ad Astra logo, an additional sign had been painted, a sign she didn't know. Yet she didn't fear it was a trick of the enemy. They had to be allies, or someone would have them notified that an unknown vehicle had entered the airspace behind them. Of course, the security codes they had to send to get close to their position could be faked, but to do so would have taken far too long to be of any use. Any remaining doubt she harbored in her heart disappeared the moment the doors of the shuttle opened, and more than 20 fully equipped soldiers sprang out of it, their armors painted in Ad Astra's colors and with the company's logo proudly displayed on their chest. The soldiers, for they couldn't be anything else with their armor, the heavy weapons, and the general air around them. Definitely not normal security officers, ran to the barricades on the side where the fighting was the most vigorous, and didn't even take a moment to sound out the situation before throwing themselves into the battle with zeal. Likewise, the hovering military transport didn't lose any time after it deposited its cargo before taking off to make space for the second shuttle. Just like the first one, its side doors opened and another 20 soldiers jumped out, the short distance to the ground not bothering them for a moment before they ran forward to support the defenders. 4 of them positioned themselves close to Tanya and Boris, and she finally got a better look at them. The armor they wore covered their whole bodies and looked to be thicker than the one Tanya wore, but despite the obvious extra weight, they moved with a speed and grace that she or anyone else in the security forces would be hard-pressed to imitate. They worked like a well-oiled machine, trusting their team members without hesitation. Hesitation itself seemed like a word they didn't know. Their every move spoke of a conviction that had to be the result of months, if not years, of training. Every time one of them got out of cover to fire a few shots, the returning fire from the enemy got less and less. It didn't take much longer, at least in Tanya's opinion, before the enemy completely stopped their attack. And when she turned to Boris, she saw that he was looking over the barricade, and a sharp smile stretched his lips thin. He turned to her, and she could see glee dancing in his eyes when he opened his mouth. "They're retreating," he said happily, before repeating it a bit louder. "They're retreating." Cheers rang out all around her, and Tanya couldn't help herself but join in. She grabbed one of the newly arrived soldiers, and without any warning hugged him as tight as she could while repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The soldier in her arms seemed at first a bit confused before patting her back awkwardly with his left arm. He chuckled lightly and said, "Just doing our job, miss. Ad Astra protects its people." "Where do you guys come from?" asked Boris, his voice rumbling a bit more than usual. "I mean, I'm glad that you're here, but I never heard of you or seen you before today. You could say we're the guys testing every new plaything that Ad Astra's sub-companies develop. And this is the first time we got sent anywhere. Normally we stay at the testing facility," responded another of the soldiers after taking his helmet off. The soldier turned toward Boris and winked, a grin playing over his face. Tanya had to suppress a snicker when she got a look at Boris's face. He looked like he absolutely didn't understand what just happened, and before he could, a voice called out, "Jackson, Pierce, stop flirting and get your asses over here. We're going to patrol the area." Alpha and Beta are pursuing the enemy to make sure that there isn't a chance for them to regroup, and our job is to take out any straggler or eclipse in hiding. The two soldiers that talked to Tanya and Boris straightened their postures and responded, "Sir, yes, sir." They gave short nods before putting their helmets back on and running toward the position where their apparent captain was waiting for them. "Well," said Tanya, "that was that." "Huh," grunted Boris with a grimace. Seeing his expression, Tanya stepped next to him and bumped him with her shoulder. She didn't manage to get him to move with her bump, but she didn't try too hard in the first place. "Now don't be like that. He seems cute," Tanya teased with a playful grin on her face. Boris slowly turned his head toward her and regarded Tanya with the most deadpan look on his face that she had ever seen on his face. "You know fully well that I have a fiancée, and I don't think that she would be amused if I start a fling with someone I don't even know." "Well, you could be right about that," Tanya responded, the playful grin not lessening in any way. "She certainly can be vicious if she thinks someone is intruding on her territory. Her time at the Batarian border and the constant fight against pirates and slavers did make her a lot more confident these past years. But I'm still of the opinion she would be more amused than anything. Margaret would never think that her teddy bear would cheat on her. I guess if you think so, then there will be no problem if I tell her that you're trying to set me up with someone so that I won't miss her, right?" said Boris and started to walk away. The playful grin on Tanya's face froze, and she looked at Boris retreating back, her eyes widening in horror when she finally registered his words. "Now wait a moment," she called after him, taking long strides to catch up with him. "There's no need for that. Come on, let's talk about it a bit more." October 25th, 2173, 2143, Erdsbad, Vuller System, Kite's Nest, City of Akar, Takar Bojek. He slammed his glass down on the table, the alcohol that had previously filled it to the halfway point burning his throat and warming him as its effects spread through his body. Takar lifted his left hand, signaling the barkeeper to refill it again with the same drink he had ordered since he entered the bar almost 2 hours ago. He only kept one pair of eyes on his fellow Batarian as he refilled the glass with the deep purple alcohol just below the brim of the glass. A flick of his wrist activated Takar's Omni tool, and he transferred the necessary credits with a little bit of extra for the service. The young Batarian manning the bar this evening would certainly need it, especially with all the chaos currently happening in the city. A few extra credits could go a long way in getting out of hairy situations. The hegemony soldiers stationed around the city had the tendency to kindly suggest that citizens should support them monetarily, or something unpleasant could happen to them when the station soldiers were not in top form due to lack of funds. Tarek snorted as he thought about their thinly veiled threats and protection racket. He had been stopped often enough by soldiers who acted more like thugs than anything else to know what was happening in this city. Sometimes they didn't even bother wrapping their threats in niceties and straight out demanded his money. It disgusted him how far the standard of the hegemony soldiers had fallen in the 10 years after he finished his service with them. Back then, his commander would have punished anyone who even thought of committing such shameful acts. And with the creativity of his commander concerning punishments, they certainly would have never thought about doing it twice. Besides, doing it twice would have meant execution by his old commander. Perhaps it was a bit harsh, but Tarek absolutely agreed with his old commander that such behavior reflected shamefully on the whole hegemony. Yet that could also be because he had been a purge trooper, an elite among the best of the best. They defended the hegemony's honor, they protected the most important people of their society, and it was them who got called whenever the hegemony needed its best soldiers. Tarek had fought for the hegemony against the traitor Vakil and his army of Vorcha slaves. He had fought when the pirate lord Jordan Klax thought that he had any right to the planets close to the Batarian border, even if they had been officially part of the Terminus systems. And Tarek would have continued to fight if it hadn't been for the injuries he sustained during those fights. Nowadays, he was simply a mid-level clerk with a cushy job in the colonial administration, a job that was as interesting and exciting as it was dangerous. In short, not at all. Yet it did pay the bills, and Tarek knew it could have been worse. Fighting had been the only thing he had ever learned, and for the first few years, he had been completely over his head with the few tasks assigned to him. Thankfully, he had learned, else even his previous position as Purge Trooper wouldn't have saved him from being shuffled to a position that would have been undoubtedly worse. After all, he could have been sent to a backwater colony and asked to categorize soil samples. Nonetheless, while it wasn't what he had dreamed of, he was grudgingly satisfied with his current position. If it wasn't for those disgraces in the street, Tarek thought grumpily, were the regular forces always this shameful? I didn't spend much time there after basic training, but I would have noticed it, wouldn't I? As long as my brethren are holding themselves to the old standard, I will have to accept it. He had only caught glimpses of some purge troopers in the city. Most of the time, he had been too far away to get a good look at them, but the colors of their armor were distinctive enough to be picked out in a crowd. Hopefully his hopes were true, and their moral code and behavior were like he remembered, as not even his past as a purge trooper would help him if they tried anything. After all, it hadn't helped with the regular forces. Tarek lifted his glass and took a generous sip of his drink before setting the glass back down and turning around on his seat, leaning his back against the counter. His eyes moved around the dimly lit bar, searching for escape routes and potential hostiles, just like the moment he had first entered the establishment. A habit that had never left him in the past 10 years and would probably never leave him for the rest of his life. It was too deeply ingrained in his being for that to happen. There was some movement on the left edge of his visual field, and Tarek managed to focus on it without making it obvious that he had noticed it. Thankfully, he identified them as the 5 young Batarians who had come here to drink and moan about their lives for the last few days. The longer they were here, the rowdier and louder they got, and while some of their statements could be constructed as borderline rebellious, they still kept within their given rights. It was the usual moaning of young Batarians who hadn't found their place in their society yet and were unhappy with the restrictions they had to adhere to thanks to their caste. In Tarek's opinion, these youths would need a few more years of seasoning before they realized that while they had only a slim chance of being promoted to a higher caste, the only thing stopping them from trying was themselves. Tarek's father had managed it, even if his forefather did a lot of groundwork, so why shouldn't anybody else manage it too? And if you can't do it, well, there was nothing stopping you from making it easier for your children to achieve it. After all, Tarek did it too. Perhaps not for his own children, as he had decided that this wasn't what he wanted, but nothing stopped him from supporting his brother and his children from achieving more than they could on their own. Before his thoughts could turn fully to the rest of his family, the door to the bar was pushed forcefully open, and a group of hegemony soldiers stalked into the room with their weapons held loosely in their hands, but nonetheless at the ready. They spread out through the room, eyeing every patron critically. It was obvious to Tarek's eyes that those soldiers were better trained and more disciplined than those he saw in the streets, and the reason why became obvious a few moments later when a Batarian in purple armor entered the room, his helmet magnetically attached to his belt. The sight of a purge trooper so close to him forced Tarek to jump from his stool and straighten his posture, especially after he noticed the rank insignia of a lieutenant on the purge trooper's left shoulder. His sudden movement caught the attention of the present soldiers, and around half of their numbers snapped their heads toward him while the rifles in their hands twitched. The other half kept their eyes on the rest of the patrons, looking for suspicious behavior. Yet despite his sudden movement, nobody showed the slightest inclination to apprehend him. Perhaps it had to do with the purge trooper, who looked at him with an appraising look. 4 eyes were trained on Tarek, and the upper 2 eye ridges were scrunched together in deep thought before they returned to their normal positions. The purge trooper walked toward him, his steps full of confidence, and stopped a few steps before Tarek. "You former military?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble, yet to Tarek's ears it sounded a bit forced, like he was trying to give himself a deeper voice. Tarek had met people who had done something like that before. They thought a deeper voice gave them a more distinguished aura and projected authority better than otherwise. It only worked on those with not much field experience as soldiers of the hegemony, and most that used that technique disregarded it after they had enough experience under their belt to be confident enough to project their authority effortlessly. To be fair, those with high-pitched voices needed that technique to be taken seriously, and some never stopped after using it long enough to become a habit. A single look was enough for Tarek to decide that the purge trooper in front of him belonged to the group for which it had become a habit. The relaxed stance of the trooper was too full of natural confidence to be anything but. 23rd Purge Trooper Regiment, discharged 10 years ago with full honors, responded Tarek, saluting the man before him, which got him a respectful nod back. 19th Regiment, under Major Vacor, said the still unnamed Purge Trooper, something Tarek knew he wouldn't get. The names of Purge Troopers would never be spoken loud in any public setting in case of them getting back to unsavory elements that would look to use them for their own needs. I heard a bit of the 23rd, continued the lieutenant, as if he was just making pleasant conversation, but Tarek noticed that most of his attention was focused on the room around him. What he was searching for wasn't Tarek's concern, and he had no intention of getting unnecessarily involved. If I remember, it was heavily involved in the Great Pirate Hunt more than a decade ago. Did you participate? From the beginning to the end, sir, answered Tarek, a bit of pride at his accomplishments during the campaign swelling his chest. The Purge Trooper Lieutenant hit his chest, right over his heart with his right hand, showing his respect in the common way among the Purge Troopers. The hegemony thanks you for your service, brother. May your deeds never be forgotten and engraved in the pillars of glory. Tarek responded with the same gesture, and after choking a bit said, Thank you, Lieutenant. May your name echo among the greatest of us. With a simple nod, the lieutenant acknowledged Tarek's words before turning around and walking toward a badly lit corner. Two of the present soldiers joined him and positioned themselves a foot behind his two shoulders. You are a difficult man to find, Tokovec. Very difficult. But I think your luck has run out now, said the Purge Trooper, barely loud enough for it to reach Tarek's ears. I did my best, answered a voice coming from a person in the corner that Tarek couldn't see very well, thanks to the bad lighting. Yet I believe you have me at a disadvantage. You know my name, but I don't know yours. Could you please rectify that? While Tarek knew it wasn't his duty to aid the soldiers and the Purge Trooper, he couldn't stop himself from trying to listen to the conversation. Perhaps it had something to do with the sudden tension that filled the room like fog and could be cut with a sharp knife. But the extremely cocky and confident tone of the person in the corner of the room set his nerves on edge. Something was going to happen, and Tarek wanted to be ready to spring into action if it was needed, the quiet voice in the back of his head compelling him to do so. No, responded the Purge Trooper sharply, his expression and tone giving no room for negotiation or further questions. Pity, I would have liked to make further conversation. As you insist on being difficult, can we please go on? State your business and be gone. The disrespectful tone elicited a growl from Tarek's throat that was thankfully quiet enough not to draw more attention to him than his short exchange with the Purge Trooper had already gathered. Tokovec, you are under arrest for the instigation of a revolt against the government, abetting other so-called revolutionaries, aiding and collaborating with foreign instigators, and treason against the hegemony. Stand up slowly with your hands over your head, or we will be forced to use violence. Is it treason if I have lost all faith in the hegemony years ago? Is it treason if those in power see us as nothing more than cattle for them to use as they see fit? Is it treason that I want my fellow Batarians to live free of the shackles placed on us from the moment of our birth? The Batarian in the corner had gotten louder with every sentence until he practically screamed the last one in the face of the Purge Trooper, who looked decidedly unimpressed at this change in volume. The same couldn't be said for the two soldiers at this side. They looked increasingly uncomfortable and shifted in their places, nervously fingering their weapons, their eyes flitting around. Tarek noted that the patrons of the establishment followed the conversation with interest, some with perhaps too much interest. Furthermore, those patrons mostly kept passive faces, but thanks to Tarek's experience, he could see traces of anger and fury in their faces, and he knew that the situation could deteriorate at a moment's notice. In the way you're doing it, responded the Purge Trooper, his relaxed demeanor not flinching in front of this performance of aggression. Yes. The Purge Trooper's answer cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter, and for a blissful moment, it was like Tarek could breathe freely again. It also had the additional effect of stopping the rant dead in its tracks. The battalion in front of the purge trooper blinked, all four eyes showing confusion at this cold response before they took on a look of acceptance. Well, if you say so. It seems like those in power have spoken. They ignored our words, and when we turn to drastic means to get them to hear us, they blame us and call us traitors to the battalion race. It was them that drove us to this point, and instead of taking responsibility, they decided to eradicate us. The battalion's voice was filled with a resigned defeat that struck Tarak like a hammer blow. He truly believed in his words. But no more, I say. The previous fire returned to his eyes and voice, and the two soldiers at the purge trooper's side took a step back, surprised by the sudden change in the battalion. Meanwhile, the Prug trooper continued to view him stoically, without any indication to stop him in his rant. That was something Tarak didn't understand. If it was him in this position, he wouldn't have allowed the battalion to speak for so long, especially not in front of a crowd where some young, impressionable battalions were present. Yet the purge trooper lieutenant did. Was it part of a plan? Did he know something, or was he hoping the battalion would reveal something while he ranted? It was as he thought about the last option that something the purge trooper had accused the battalion of came back to the forefront of his mind. One of the accusations was the aiding and collaboration with foreign instigators. Could one of the other political entities try to incite a rebellion within the battalion hegemony and use this unrest to push their agenda? Tarak shelved this line of thought for the moment as the rebellious battalion continued with his rant. We will fight back against the oppressors. May the pillars be on our side and strike those undeserving of their mercy down. He pointed toward the purge trooper, and Tarak noticed movement in the corner of his eye. A slight turn of the head was enough to see what was happening, and before his brain could completely process the information, his mouth was already moving. Gun! Everybody down! Tarak threw himself on the floor, the gun in the hands of a battalion, firing 2 shots before the air was filled with more bullets as apparent collaborators of Tokavek pulled out their guns too. Some of the soldiers reacted slowly, surprised by the sudden violence, but most of them raised their rifles in time to fire back without mercy, killing the attackers in a shower of bullets while their kinetic shields stopped the bullets of the attackers. As sudden as the violence started, it ended just as fast, like a flash of lightning illuminating the night sky. And like thunder followed a lightning strike, the screams of the other patrons followed too. The soldiers did their best to reassure those caught in the violence with more or less success. Meanwhile, Tarak slowly stood up, shaking off the glass splinters that fell on his back when some stray bullets hit the bottles on the shelf behind the bar, and took stock of the situation. Thankfully, none of the soldiers or the uninvolved bystanders had been badly injured, and the worst injury had been caused to the barkeeper by the falling glass splinters. Tarak heard one of the soldiers speaking into his omnitool, calling for a medic, but the unhurried tone suggested that there were no serious injuries and that the attackers had been killed. As his mind turned back to the attackers, Tarak's head snapped toward the purge trooper, who stood still in the same position, calmly holding a pistol right in the middle of Tokavek's eyes. Did you think we wouldn't be ready for such an action? We entered the establishment ready for an attack from the onset. I could certainly try. I won't ever surrender without a fight. While Tokavek tried to feign confidence with his words, the fact that all 4 eyes were focused on the muzzle of the pistol in front of his face betrayed his nervousness. I'm sure, drawled the purge trooper, with a tone that conveyed his disbelief. Our interrogators will be glad you still have so much fight in you. They get bored if their interviewees spill their secrets too easily. With a nod of his head, the purge trooper ordered 2 soldiers to cuff Vek and take him away, probably to a prisoner transport that was waiting outside. They marched him out of the room, just stepping aside for a moment to make way for the medics who entered the room, and Tarak let out a relieved sigh when they left the room. The lead medic scanned the room and ordered his assistants around while walking over to Tarak as the worst injured. The barkeeper stood right behind him, leaning on the bar, blood slowly dropping on it from a wound right above his right eyes. A simple application of Medigel and the gash was closed. It didn't take long until the rest of the bystanders got treated, some getting a mild sedative to calm their frayed nerves. It didn't take long with the purge trooper standing in the middle of the room and ordering the remaining soldiers to clean the place up before nothing but a few bullet holes in the floor, and walls reminded of the sudden burst of violence that had happened here just a few minutes ago. After all but two soldiers, who stood right next to the entrance, had vacated the place, the lieutenant walked, his steps calm and sure as always, toward the barkeeper, who had gotten a clean bill of health from the lead medic, and coughed silently. I and the Batarian hegemony are deeply sorry that it came to such violence on your premise. Are you the owner of this establishment? The barkeeper, still slightly shocked and under the influence of the light sedatives, shook his head and answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ah, no, sir. I'm not. The owner only comes by once a week, and the last time was 2, or was it 3, days ago. He won't show up in the next few days. He took a moment to think before continuing. But if he hears about what happened, I believe he will come if he's still in the city. Then let me transfer some funds he will need to refurbish and repair the damages. It's only right if the hegemony pays the damages, as they were caused by one of our operations. I will not have people say that there was any truth in that traitor's words, and that the hegemony doesn't take care of its citizens. The purge trooper held up his left hand, his Omni tool flaring up in a brilliant orange, and the barkeeper, too baffled by what was happening, copied him, his own Omni tool also flashing. I believe this number of credits should be enough, said the purge trooper, lowering his hand as the barkeeper stared at his Omni tool, his eyes widening at the number displayed. Take around a day's wage for yourself, see it as hazard pay, but I trust that most will find its way to the owner, correct? The last word was less of a question than a hidden or else, but from the expression the barkeeper wore as he nodded dumbly, Tarek did not doubt that the owner would get his money. The issue of reparations done with. The purge trooper nodded respectfully in Tarek's direction, who returned the gesture and left the bar with the last two soldiers turning on their heels and following him out the door. Just as the last soldier left, the atmosphere in the room lost the last bit of tension that was always present whenever a Batarian in uniform was present, and Tarek took a deep breath, letting the air out slowly to let go of the last remaining tension in his body. He sat back down at his usual place at the counter and turned to the barkeeper, his eyes turning downward where his glass was still standing, almost completely full. While it hadn't toppled over, he could see some glass splinters floating around in the liquid when he lifted the glass to inspect it. "Could you make me a new one?" he asked the barkeeper, holding the glass toward him. The barkeeper looked bewildered at Tarek and eloquently asked, "Huh?" With a roll of his eyes, Tarek repeated the question. "Could you make me a new one? This one has some splinters in it, and after the action just now, I certainly need a stiff drink." Thankfully, there was no need to repeat the question a third time, as the barkeeper silently took the glass, poured the drink away, and after taking a look at the glass, threw it in the trash before grabbing 2 new ones and putting them on the counter. Instead of pulling Tarek's usual go-to-alcohol from the shelf, the barkeeper grabbed a bottle of a much more expensive alcohol from the top and filled the 2 glasses with a generous amount. At Tarek's questioning look, he just shrugged his shoulder and said, "I need a drink too, and after what just happened, I'm certain the boss will forgive me if I take a bit from the good stuff." The barkeeper held up a glass full of a violet liquid, and with a thankful nod of his head, Tarek accepted the glass. Tarek smelled an interesting mix that reminded him of some kind of flowers and freshly fallen rain as he lifted the drink and took a tentative sip. The drink was, in Tarek's opinion, pretty decent, but the subtle notes of the alcohol weren't to his taste. Apparently, the barkeeper thought the same as he pulled a grimace and said, "For that price, I would have thought it would be better." "Quite so," agreed Tarek, and threw back the glass, drinking the rest in one gulp. "Tastes like something the damn Blue Menaces drink." "The bottle comes from a sorry space, so it's likely. Perhaps we just don't have their refined taste." The two chuckled at their barb at the Asari and their projected aura of luxury. Tarek didn't know any Batarian outside those of higher standing who didn't enjoy throwing barbs at the Asari, and even among those there was no shortage of mockery against the self-perceived rulers of the galaxy. "I would prefer to stay with my usual if it's no bother," said Tarek and held out his empty glass to the barkeeper. While emptying his own glass, the barkeeper pointed down to the counter with his free hand and put his own glass next to Tarek's after gulping down his drink and shuddering at the taste. He grabbed the bottle of Tarek's go-to drink and filled the 2 glasses to the brim. It would take the whole bottle and a half after that before Tarek decided to call it a night. The troubles that gripped the planet were forgotten, at least for the rest of the night. October 25th, 2173, 2208, SUV Pythia, Unnamed Star System, STG Captain Morag Tay. All systems green, we're safely in the star system. I want a full scan of the system, called Morag out from his position, looking at the data that was displayed on the display in front of him. I want the system mapped as soon as possible. Any sign of life is to be reported immediately, and I want to know if there is a mass relay in the system. Furthermore, get the communication beacon running. We have been out of contact with the Union for almost 20 standard rotations. Who knows if there is still a civilization to return to? After finishing, the Solarians on the bridge began to follow their captain's orders with the usual efficiency that Morag expected of them. There was no loud chatter. All communication happened silently enough so that everyone would still be able to hear the captain without him having to scream if he had more orders to give. It didn't take long before the results of the first scan of the system appeared on Morag's display, telling him that the system had 4 planets, none that showed any signs of advanced life forms, with the capability of space travel during the preliminary investigation. This didn't mean that there wasn't an as-of-yet undiscovered species living on one of the planets, but the composition of the planets indicated that either there was no budding civilization or they had evolved to live on a desert planet, as the other 3 were gas giants. No signs of any mass relay in the system yet, said one of the officers. We haven't been able to confirm if there is one on the other side of the system, but we don't think that there is one. The usual readings didn't show up. It could be in a nearby system, but to confirm our hypothesis, we would need to deploy our more powerful scanning equipment to check how far away the systems are. Permission granted, replied Morag, eager to get things done. The more accurate data they would get from the equipment would be a blessing when they returned, and he had to report his findings to the Secchi committee that was in charge of overseeing this mission. How did the drive hold up, he asked when a Solarian wearing a closed lab coat stepped next to him. It held up well, a little bit overheated, but that was expected after the long time we kept it running. Nothing outside the security parameters, answered Dr. Selke, his eyes shining gleefully. It did take too long, murmured Morag disdainfully. The travel time was within expectations, countered Dr. Selke without missing, his enthusiasm not diminishing at Morag's comment. From what I know, the humans can do it in a quarter or a fifth of the time. And they have at least a decade more than us in experience with this kind of engine, the doctor chided. You can't expect us to be on the same level, especially without their help. And since Command doesn't want the humans to know that we managed to replicate their unique form of space travel, it will take some time before our DR drives can compete with theirs. Knowing that the doctor's words were correct, Morag pressed his lips together, stopping his thoughts about the situation from being verbalized. Instead, he let out a sigh and nodded his acceptance. Furthermore, continued Dr. Selke, look out the window. We are the first Solarians, maybe even the first life forms that visited the system. If that isn't enough to get your mood up, then I don't know what will. Quieter, but still loud enough that Morag was able to hear it. And to think that the humans enjoyed this privilege for decades already. I'm quite jealous. Morag had a hard time not making any snide remarks or rolling his eyes. Yes, the humans were impressive. He heard it often enough out of the doctor's mouth, who couldn't stop praising them for their invention. Besides, he could admit it. After all, he knew how much effort his fellow STG members put into the project and how often they hit a roadblock during their research. Nothing to say about the failures that happened. There was still an enormous hole on Surkesh where an STG base had been. Yet he also knew enough about humans that he knew that they descended from a primates, an animal that still existed on their homeworld, an animal that liked to throw feces at each other. There was a reason why STG members called humans shit-flingers while off duty. Captain, we have a tentative connection with the nearest STG relay, reported the communications officer, a young Solarian who had joined the STG only a few months ago. Wonderful, said Morag, clapping his hands. Is it encrypted? No, sir, the young Solarian replied. The connection is barely enough for a data transmission. We neither have video nor audio, and I don't think a real-time conversation is possible. I thought we dropped some relay beacons while in transmission. They should stop this problem from happening in the first place. Are they inactive? Well, that's the problem, sir. There are no relay beacons, none at all. Morag looked at the young communication officer stumped, thinking about what to do now. After a few seconds, he ordered, "Then send a text message that we safely arrived in the system and that we will continue with our mission parameters as discussed. Data will be transferred after our return or when we have an encrypted channel. Use the standard STG code." The young Solarian nodded, showing that he understood his order, and hurried away to fulfill them. Hummed Dr. Selke. "You have a theory," stated Morag, not even bothering to ask him to share it. The doctor would do so on his own without any prompting. Something that was at times useful, at others, absolutely maddening. "We deployed the relay beacons while we were inside the dimensional rift. I think that they are still inside, or drifted so far off our path that they could be all over the galaxy. Perhaps one STG listening post got suddenly a better signal than before. If that are your two predominating theories, I sincerely hope it is the former. Should one of those beacons be found somewhere where it shouldn't be, then it could cause a diplomatic incident." "Well, we will probably never know," said Dr. Selke, and ended the topic decisively with an uncaring shrug. "We should concentrate on our mission and return home when we are done. I need to confer with my colleagues about the data I collected during transit. Our version of the DR drive should see massive improvements in the coming year, and if I'm not mistaken, we will level with the humans in the next 3. "That is something I like to hear," answered Captain Morag with a smile on his face. "The first since he accepted the mission. It wouldn't take long, and the Solarian Union would be, once again, the galactic civilization that stood at the top of technological advancement." Developing their own version of the DR drive was just the beginning. In Morag's mind, a new age had just begun for the Solarian people. Chapter 42. October 25th, 2173, 1809. Ilium, Tessel System. Nos Astra, Temporary Eclipse Field HQ. "Damn it," cursed Iara Nesta over and over again while kicking a crate with her armor-clad foot. During her last kick, as her temper flared up, a blue haze with some violet slices coated her leg, and when her foot met the crate, it flew through the room and hit the opposing wall with a resounding crack. How could it go so wrong and so fast at that? The Eclipse lieutenants behind her exchanged meaningful looks with each other. It wasn't like they had known that their operations on Ilium would receive such a setback, and that the human company they got hired to attack would fight back with an unprecedented amount of ferocity. But in hindsight, they could agree that everything went downhill from the moment they accepted the job, without looking deeply into the matter. And now they were paying the price in men, resources, and reputation. "Maybe we should consider pulling out." One of the 2 Solarian lieutenants present spoke up, but closed his mouth with a snap when Iara Nesta turned around and fixated him with a furious expression. "So, you want us to give up? Run away like a Varan with his tail between his legs? The proud mercenary company with a history tracing back centuries fleeing from an upstart human company that doesn't even specialize in fighting. Would you like us to become the laughingstock of the galaxy? And what do you think Sedaris will do to us if that comes true?" Huh? A shudder went through the whole group as they imagined the reaction of Jonah Sedaris when she heard that they bungled this mission, especially since Iara took this mission without Sedaris's knowledge, and all her lieutenants agreed with her decision. Perhaps it hadn't been their brightest idea, as Sedaris wasn't notably known for her ability to share power, but the promised money and assets that would have gotten if they finished the mission successfully would have curbed Sedaris' temper and put them into a higher position within Eclipse. Yet right now, they were in danger of ending up as paste on the floor if Sedaris heard about their exploits. If there was something she hated more than disobedience, then it was failure, and what they were currently facing was certainly a failure of epic proportions. "What about the Shadow Broker's agent? Couldn't she help us out? After all, with her help, we killed those human elite teams," the second Solarian suggested after Iara offered her opinion on the proposed retreat. "Impossible," Iara shot the idea down. "The agent got hired over our benefactor, and she told me it was a one-off deal between her and the shadow broker. Besides, that agent isn't on Ilium anymore. We wouldn't have so many problems otherwise. She didn't mention that involving the shadow broker on their own would reduce the promised payment substantially, and Sidaris' due and their own expenses were already high enough that there wouldn't be much left for them. We will have to continue with what we have, she continued, hiding a wince as she calculated the chance of coming out on top. It was lower than she would have liked, something around 50%. Normally, she wouldn't engage an enemy unless their chances were around 70% at their lowest, but the sudden reinforcements on the enemy side put that to rest. Furthermore, Ira didn't know how much more the enemy could bring to the field. In the worst-case scenario, their chances would sink to 20% or even lower. Deep in thought, she didn't notice the video screens of the surveillance equipment they had set up in this temporary field HQ, and the people it showed that were on their way towards this room. If she had, Iara would have been relieved that they wore armor with the Eclipse colors and emblem proudly displayed. And on the other hand, she would have been absolutely terrified because she would have recognized the Asari leading the mercenaries. In the end, it was the polite knocking on the door that brought Iara and her lieutenants out of their thoughts. And her first reaction was to scream, "I thought I told you fuckers that I don't want to be disturbed while we're planning out next steps." Apparently, her choice of words had been wrong, because the next time, it wasn't polite knocking that came from the door, but a loud crack as a fist, shrouded in deep blue biotics, crashed through it and left a hole big enough to push a head through. Yet it wasn't a head that came through, but two armor-clad hands that gripped the sides of the newly made hole. Iara and the two Solarians watched with horrified expressions, their hastily drawn weapons shaking slightly in their hands, as the two halves of the door slowly, and with a terrible screech, got pushed apart. Second, the door took to open fully was akin to torture for Iara. She didn't know who was on the other side, but she knew it wasn't the humans, and in her mind, that was by far more terrifying, as that probably meant someone higher up in Eclipse hierarchy had noticed the absence of her group's usual reports and had come to investigate. As Iara finally got over her state of shock, the door was already halfway open, and the screeching suddenly stopped before there was a blue explosion of biotics, and the doors were thrown open fully in one go. A crash echoed through the room and probably through the rest of the base, and Iara could see how some cracks appeared on the side of the door frame caused by the power that had thrown the doors aside. A small cloud of dust had been thrown up, blocking the sight of Iara and her lieutenants for the moment, but that didn't mean they couldn't hear the slow clicking of approaching heels. It took only a moment longer before they could finally see who had arrived at their temporary base, and when Iara saw the Asari that entered the room in front of a number of other Asari, Solarians and mechs, her eyes widened in recognition of her immediately. And while the Asari, who was obviously leading this team, wasn't Yona Sidaris, this only slightly reassured Iara as the possible outcome changed from long and painful torture, followed by death, to getting messily killed. Sadly, not a change that would allow her to see the beginning of the next day. Now, said the Asari, entering the room and not even looking at Iara and the two Solarians. Instead, she was more interested in the scuff marks on her gloves. Is that the correct way to address a superior who came by to see how you're doing? Of course not, Ms. We just didn't expect you, stammered one of the Solarians toward Kalara Iori, one of Jonas Cedrus' top commanders. You're right, it isn't, she agreed, and didn't even look up at the Solarian, who had answered and completely ignored his presence as she crossed the room toward Iara. And you, my dear, should know that I insist on good manners. Or has your promotion to the leader of your own little subgroup caused you to forget everything you learned under me? Iara gulped as she looked into the ice-cold eyes of her former direct superior, and was instantly reminded of the times she watched Iori punish unruly members of Eclipse who were part of her group. Sometimes she still heard their begging when she tried to sleep. I'm sorry, mistress. I haven't forgotten what you have taught me, Iara answered, and promptly looked toward the ground to try to avert the madness that hid behind the frigidness of Iori's eyes. Good, said Iori and patted Iara's cheek. Every time Iori's hand made contact, Iara couldn't help but twitch as if she was expecting to be hit. While I don't doubt that you remember my lessons, I think reminding you of them will help you become better than you currently are. After all, We will have enough time to work on that while we are here. We, Yara asked, and when her voice trembled a bit at the thought of spending more time in the presence, nobody noticed it or ignored it completely. Of course we, my dear, Ayori repeated in a sing-song voice that belied the danger the woman was. After Jonah heard how much trouble you had from your newest contractor, she was of a mind to personally pay you a visit and take control of the situation. Sadly, her timetable didn't allow for such, so I volunteered to take this mission. After all, you were once one of my subordinates, and I feel like this is somehow my fault because I didn't train you as best as I could have before you took on your own command. But that is something I will rectify in the next few days. You will be one of my lieutenants again, and I will only let you go after I'm satisfied with your performance. While she talked, Ayori softly put her hands on Iyara's cheeks like a lover, and the tone she spoke with wouldn't have been out of place when a mother talked to her child. Yet Iyara didn't feel any of the love or safety a child would. The horror she felt at the thought of being Ayori's subordinate was great enough that she couldn't keep it from her face. But instead of being put out, Ayori's smile grew even bigger at the sight of it. "What about my lieutenants?" asked Iyara. "What lieutenants?" "I think she means us," said one of the two Solarians, raising his hand as if to report for duty. Ayori glimpsed at him before sighing and letting Iyara's face go. She took a step back, her arms hanging limply at her side. Then, as fast as a lightning strike, she drew her shotgun with one hand and took aim at the Solarian who had spoken up. Echoed through the room as Ayori pulled the trigger, and the Solarian's head turned into a fine red mist. Her arm was still straight after she had pulled the trigger, the slight shine of active biotics the only hint that she used them to mitigate the recoil. "I repeat, what lieutenants?" said Ayori, her sing-song tone coming through once more. The remaining Solarian lieutenants took this as his chance to leave, and he didn't waste a second before he started to run out of the room. Yet he didn't come far as Ayori snapped the fingers of her offhand, and the mechs, like the machines they were, started to fire their guns as one, shooting the running Solarian from all directions until he was lying on the floor drowning in a pool of his own blood. And even then, the mechs continued to fire at the obviously dead man until their weapons overheated. They would have continued to fire if Ayori hadn't snapped her fingers again to return them to their rest positions. One of the lessons we will have to go over is how to choose competent subordinates. I do not doubt that it was their fault that this operation stagnated so much. Or was it your fault? The way Ayori looked at her let Iyara's blood freeze in her veins. It was the look of a predator that was looking for the slightest miscalculation on Iyara's end. And if she remembered her mentor as well as she thought she did, then there was only one possible answer that would let her avoid certain death. "I don't know, mistress," answered Iyara demurely, knowing that a definite yes or no would be the wrong answer. "It could have been my fault, but I'm willing to look for my faults and correct them." "As I thought," said Ayori with a smile on her face. "You haven't forgotten the first rule I established. Always be on the lookout to better yourself. If you keep that in mind, then there will be no problems going forward." Iyara let out a sigh of relief at knowing that she had chosen correctly, and that her former, or perhaps once again mentor, hadn't changed in the last 30 years. "Now," continued Ayori, and her smile turned bloodthirsty, "tell me all about those humans you have so many problems with, and we will see if we can't come up with a plan that will see them put in their rightful place, right underneath our boots." October 25th, 2173, 2129, Ilium to Sail System, Nos Astra, Ad Astra HQ, Ilium Branch. Listening to the reports coming in from the different teams around Nos Astra in our operations area brought a smile to my face. I hadn't expected that the tides would turn this fast after our reinforcements arrived, but they had blown all my expectations out of the water, and then some. Commander Svensson's men were truly among the best Ad Astra had to offer. Yet a nagging thought at the back of my mind told me that this whole affair wasn't nearly over, but going into the next act instead. I couldn't pinpoint why I felt this way and was about to write this feeling off as paranoia. But something stopped me from dismissing this thought completely. Call it premonition or instincts or something along those two. Besides, it wouldn't hurt to prepare for the worst-case scenario if my feelings were correct, and I didn't get to my position without listening to my instincts or vague feelings from time to time. Sometimes our subconsciousness knew better than our consciousness after all. I just got another message from our logistics squad at the docks, said Commander Abebe, and I looked up from the datapad I had been reading. Any critical damage sustained during the fighting in the area that could have impeded the safe landing, discharging, and loading of our ships is now patched up, and, in their words, the only work left is of a cosmetic nature and can wait for a few more rotations. Wonderful, I exclaimed with a bright smile on my face. I was worried when the reports came in that told us there was a real danger that the docks could be inoperable for some time if they weren't fixed quickly. And I think we can go with their suggestion that cosmetics can wait for the moment. Any recommendation on their next job? Commander Abebe lifted her right hand to her chin as she thought about my question. Absent-mindedly, she stroked with her thumb over her chin, as she always did when she considered the pros and cons of a decision. The corner of my mouth twitched in amusement at this unconscious gesture. I would prefer to send them to Checkpoint Gamma first. The work on the defensive structure there is somewhat behind our schedule. I know we didn't give them much time in the first place, but they are more behind than the other 4 checkpoints. And how is the danger prediction for Checkpoint Gamma? Don't you think we shouldn't concentrate on where an attack is most likely? I asked. Not out of any real concern that her reasoning was wrong, but because I decided to play devil's advocate for most of the decisions, as there weren't enough people left to question Commander Abebe without feeling the pressure of rank. While it's true that checkpoints Delta and Epsilon are closer to where we suspect Eclipse's base of operations, and they are not that much further with their defensive structures, we have to keep in mind that we're not dealing with a fixed front line. Eclipse and the other mercenaries they hired could go around and attack Charlie without coming up on Delta or Epsilon's scanners. Furthermore, if we lose Charlie, those two will be cut off from our direct supply line, and it's highly possible that they will fall in short order if they get surrounded on all sides by enemy forces. It's better, in my opinion, to fortify Charlie so that we can send reinforcements in all directions from that point. As Abebe voiced her thoughts on the issue, I nodded along with her words, only listening half-heartedly, keeping one eye on the new data appearing on my datapad. Sounds like you already have a well-thought-out plan in mind, I said after she finished relaying her points. We will do it this way. Can't see anything wrong with it. Commander Abebe must have noticed that I hadn't followed her deliberations with much enthusiasm, as she gave me a look that would have sent some of her subordinates running before she let out a sigh and shook her head tiredly. Is there something interesting going on, sir? She asked, noticing that my eyes were focused on the datapad before me. You could say that. It's another piece on the current events in the galaxy. Are they talking about the mini-war we're fighting here on Ilium? She asked, and it was a good question, in my opinion. Should the rest of the galaxy look too closely, I would probably have no other choice but to retreat from Ilium before it turned too ugly, as that would have hurt my political aspiration in the long run. They still see it as just a minor skirmish. There's a greater focus on the turmoil in the Batarian hegemony. That one looks like it's going to turn into open rebellion on one planet any day now. Besides, if you're looking into news from and around Ilium, the only piece that's really interesting is the attempt of the Citadel Council to intervene in the consequences thereof. I couldn't help the smirk that appeared on my face as I thought about that little tidbit. The Citadel Council, in all their glorious and unimaginable wisdom, decided to try to intervene in the armed conflict that I got involved in. Of course, it had nothing to do with me being a person of high public interest in the Alliance and with my rising reputation outside it, and they would never try to curb my and humanity's influence by doing so. Sadly, they hadn't thought about the consequences of trying to dictate terms for the end of the conflict by basically ordering the Asari matriarchs of Ilium to intervene. Those matriarchs didn't like being ordered around and pointed out, with all the politeness and hidden viciousness only beings with over 800 years of life experience had, that Ilium wasn't part of the Asari republics or inside Citadel territory, and thus the Council didn't have any say about what was happening on the planet. Overall, that had started an apparently ancient discussion about the rights, privileges, duties, and everything else of Ilium's relationship with the Citadel and vice versa. Thankfully, no one had any interest in me after that, and I continued to safeguard my interests with every method available to me. It's nice to see that sometimes you don't have to do anything to keep noisy people away from your things. As long as we keep this between us and Eclipse and their employers, we will be fine. Ilium's government and its Asari matriarchs won't involve themselves so long the rest of the planet can continue to operate in its usual fashion. I finished, and Commander Abebe had a relieved look on her face. That's good. I have enough on my plate with making sure our people are safe. I wouldn't have liked to get involved in a political shitstorm too. Despite her fears of this becoming political, I wasn't as concerned. I gestured dismissively at her worries and said, "You wouldn't have to deal with them anyway. After all, that's one job I would take over completely. And even if I wasn't here, the guys in the PR department are more than enough to deal with it. They would probably come up with a solution that would let us come out of this smelling like roses, no matter how much shit gets thrown around. Perhaps I should involve them anyway. Even if there was no huge problem that would necessitate hard work on their side, it would be better to nip any potential problems before they could grow into something annoying." Commander Abebe looked like she wanted to continue to discuss the placement of the coming second wave of Commander Svensson's men that would be coming in the next 1 or 2 days and would bring with them some mobile armor. But before she could get a word out, one of the communications officers ran over breathlessly and said, "Sir, there's a highly encrypted call coming in for you. We traced the signal and it comes from the planet. There was only one word in the message to describe what this call is about, and it says Alamina. Does this mean anything to you, sir?" I had already wondered when this call would come. After all, the fighting wasn't exactly quiet, but until now the other members of the circle had kept themselves out of my affairs, and perhaps I would have preferred to keep it that way. No matter, I would tell them that I had it well under control and try to keep them neutral in this. Should they offer any support, I would decline. The favors they would certainly expect in return for any help were not something I was willing to pay, especially since any support they could offer me would only be a drop of water on a hot stone and nothing more. "Reroute the call to the secure conference room. I will be taking it there. Furthermore, please make sure that nobody can listen in." I turned toward Commander Abebe and added, "I don't believe this will take long. Continue to plan our next offensive, and we will go over it when I'm done with this." Without much further ado, I got up from my seat and walked out of the command center in the direction of the secure conference room. A short elevator ride later, and I was on the right floor. Getting into the room required me to put my hand against the holographic lock, and seconds later the door opened smoothly without any sound beyond the click it made after I entered the room, and it closed again. A low-key humming started to sound as the holographic projector started to warm up, and the counterintelligence measures did as well. Just as I took my seat, the projections of 4 different people started to form around the conference table, and I critically watched each of them, trying to see if any of their body language could give me a clue who had called for this meeting in the first place and why. At first glance, I didn't notice anything, but after a few moments, as everybody got comfortable and I shared a respectful nod with Nisko Ron, I saw that Shintanius Sicario looked tenser than he usually was during a meeting like this. Narrowing my eyes, I decided to get some people to check on his latest activities, more out of caution than truly believing him to be involved in my current troubles with Eclipse. It was better to be careful with things like this than to be blindsided. Besides, the only one I trusted in this group to not stab me in the back was Nisko Ron, and that was only because he would lose far more than he would gain by breaking his connection with me. Mirala and I may have a mutually beneficial agreement, and our sexual activities may be fun, but I wouldn't put it past her to turn on me if she got an offer that would better her position. Sicario. That one was as mercenary as they come. Our previous deal wouldn't mean much to him. Should anyone pay him, he would support them against me without a second thought. But the one I knew the least about how she would act was Ayala Nasara. Her shyness and bashfulness made it hard to keep any conversation going beyond a certain point. Furthermore, it made her hard to read. If anything, she could already be part of the attack on me since the first attack happened after I flew back to Ad Astra's HQ after I finished a deal with her. Yet my thoughts about their possible involvement were stopped when Cesario started to speak, beginning the meeting and confirming for me who had called for it in the first place. "It's good to see you all present. I called for this meeting to discuss Denebrin's ongoing war against Eclipse and what it means for the rest of us. Furthermore, I got a message from our unofficial 6th member, the Arbiter." This news got me to perk up. Anything involving the Arbiter, the one who stayed in the background and made sure that any contracts and agreements between Circle members were honored, was bound to be interesting.